Thank you for joining MedCrypt's Cybersecurity Terminology webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our host today, Axel, and he will get the webinar started.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. As Kate was saying, we're going to deal mainly with the topic of cybersecurity terminology. Few things briefly about myself. I have actually been in the healthcare and medical device industries my entire professional career. Started out as a hardware engineer, eventually ended up in health IT and health software, and since 2009, I'm in cybersecurity with focus on healthcare and medical devices. So today, our main topic, 80% of this presentation is going to be on cybersecurity terminology. And this is really more geared towards newcomers on the topic. I'm going to discuss some very foundational concepts and again, terminology in cybersecurity to get you started on the topic. And then we're going to deal with a couple of specific areas of interest, including secure lifecycle management, threat modeling, and vulnerability management. So why is cybersecurity terminology important, and who is it actually important for? Right, and there are different stakeholders. It could be, government, regulators, lawmakers, various agencies, healthcare, public health agencies that deal with healthcare and risks to the healthcare industry, which nowadays includes cybersecurity. Could also be you on the operator side. You could be a hospital or other care provider or third-party health service provider or consultant, or you could be a manufacturer or a distributor, vendor of medical devices or medical IT systems. And lastly, really everybody who writes or publishes on the topic of medical device cybersecurity. I think the reason that I started developing this particular topic a couple of months ago, and why I think it is important, is really that medical device cybersecurity is a multi-stakeholder topic, right? We need to be able to communicate across different roles inside and outside of our organizations and across different backgrounds. But also we need to understand that the concepts we're using, and we get to several of them in a moment, in medical device cybersecurity really come in part from traditional IT security, as well as in part from traditional safety risk management. So depending on who you are, what your background is, or who you're talking to, you need to put their use of terminology into the right context and consider their background and how they may be interpreting certain terms related to, again, medical device cybersecurity. So the first one I want to walk through, this is still fairly abstract, but nevertheless, talk about the concept of cyber risk. Right. So in order to have cyber risk, we need three components. We need to have an asset, which is anything that has value to us, and that can be a system, a device, a resource, material, a process, a relationship, but even things like reputation. We need a threat, right? And that is an external circumstance that could compromise our asset. And we need to have a vulnerability that the threat could exploit in order to compromise the asset. And only if we have all three do we have a cyber risk, right? If one of those three is absent, we don't have a risk. In reality, you have varying components of all three, right? And depending on the degree of threats you're exposed to, the size of the vulnerabilities you have in your system, and the value of your assets, your risk varies quite significantly. In other words, right, you want to protect patient data with much greater effort than, for example, the week's menu in your cafeteria. And I think those concepts translate directly to how we look at cyber risk. So we need a threat, a vulnerability, an asset in order to have risk. Then we apply what is called risk controls, which then results in an acceptable residual risk. And we'll talk about that concept in just a moment. A couple of notes to round this off here. Assets can be tangible things, computers, or anything that is represented on computers through data or information, like money, for example. But they can also be intangible. your reputation as a device manufacturer, your reputation as a hospital, but it can also be the trust of your customers or your patients in your organization, or the safety of patients within the walls of your organization. And then also to understand that we typically estimate risk based on the probability of it occurring and the severity, meaning the impact it has. When we look at medical devices specifically, there's a wide range of risks we need to consider. The most important one, obviously, is patient safety. And it doesn't matter whether the compromise of a medical device is intentional or unintentional, it can lead to patient harm. It can impact the device's functionality, its reliability, its availability, can lead to misdiagnosis or treatment errors. We can also have impact on care delivery. And if we think back a couple of years on what happened at the NHS in the UK with WannaCry, right, impact on care delivery was significant. 81 hospitals had to completely or partially shut down, right? Or emergency rooms need to be closed down and patients need to be diverted to other hospitals. So any reduction in your ability to deliver care can be the consequence of a cyber incident. Then, of course, we have privacy, and even within privacy, we have a degree of complexity. We have certainly PHI, protected health information, patient data, but we also have identities, address information, insurance information, network or user credentials, and then lastly, things like financial data, HR or contract data, merger and acquisition information, anything that pertains to the business. So even privacy has quite a range. It's much more than just patient data. Then also we need to think about a given device or a given system becoming an attack vector, right? It can be exploited as a weak system. It can become an entry point or a beachhead for an attack. And unfortunately, we have evidence for these kind of attacks actually taking place. A device can be put into a denial of service attack. It can be, for example, become a distributor of spam email as part of a botnet. And the attack compromising a device can be purely opportunistic, right? The attacker may not even realize that they are compromising a medical device. They may just have looked for, let's say, an unpatched Windows 10 computer and found it, again, not realizing it was a device. Then, of course, there's business or financial impact through your reputation, through revenue impact, loss of referrals, lawsuits, fines, and if you're publicly traded, can impact your stock value. And then a list of indirect risks, things like patient trust, patient treatment decisions, right? Patients may reject perfectly sensible treatments if they hear about a cyber risk to the devices that are part of that treatment. Could impact also staff morale, and then lastly, national security. So this really is a summary of the things I talked about. The last bullet here, I just want to touch again, and that is, what is actually your perspective of an asset. We already talked about the tangible and the intangible nature of an asset, but also if you're a healthcare delivery organization, right, an asset is basically everything on your network, every medical device, every industrial control system, every server, every desktop, every mobile device, and the data they're holding, obviously. But if you're a manufacturer, you're designing a new device, your view of the assets is very different. Those are then the components you design into your device, right? Things like a database, your operating system, a video driver, a Bluetooth radio you're buying from a third party, and. So again, assets can have a very different context and meaning depending on who you are and what you do. But nevertheless, having a complete understanding of your assets and understanding each asset in sufficient detail is a prerequisite to managing cyber risk. Now, if we talk about analyzing cyber risk, we need to understand that in cyberspace, we're not dealing with statistical events, right? Unlike in traditional safety risk management, where we have data, for example, from field devices or data obtained through destructive testing of devices, but we don't have that background in cybersecurity. Therefore, we may talk about probability, certainly, but the interpretation of probability is typically different as we're looking at how exploitable a particular component or a particular vulnerability is. Right? Whether it has happened in the past, whether there's any historic evidence of that vulnerability being compromised, doesn't matter. If there's a vulnerability, its risk exposure to compromise in the future is based on how easy it would be to compromise it. Whether it has happened in the past or not doesn't matter. A typical method for then estimating risk is that I estimate the severity of harm, meaning what would the impact be should this vulnerability be compromised, and the probability of harm, or how easy it would be to exploit a certain vulnerability or a certain software component. And then I can do a simple calculation based on, in this example, a 1 through 4 scale, multiplying those numbers, and I get then a risk priority matrix that helps me to determine where I should spend most of my efforts and most of my money on mitigating. Now, this is just an example of one way of estimating risk and probabilities. There are many other methods out there. There are other matrices out there that are being used. One example that is used commonly for vulnerability scoring is the CVSS score, and I'll talk about that in more detail later, its strength and its weaknesses. But it is a multi-parameter assessment and scoring of a vulnerability rather than a simple, let's say, expert assessment on a 1 through 4 scale. Right. So again, this is just an example here. People use other matrices. People use other methodologies. Have written books about various ways of estimating risk. So again, this is just a concept. And again, back to my point from earlier, that historic experience in cybersecurity, unfortunately, is not a good predictor of the future. Since here in the US, we're heading for Thanksgiving season, right? I take the liberty to use the example of the Thanksgiving turkey, who has had a great life until we hit October and the turkeys are going to get slaughtered. So the same is true for cybersecurity. You have a vulnerability that has never been exploited in the past. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going to happen tomorrow. Risk management, basic terminology. We talk about a risk analysis. That is what we just looked at as in the matrix as one example on how you can estimate a risk. Then once we have estimated the risk, we compare it against our acceptability criteria, right? And we should establish that based on objective measures on the level of the business, and then find out if I have a risk of a certain score, is it acceptable or is it not acceptable? And those two combined are considered the risk assessment. So risk analysis and risk assessment are two different things, analysis being a step leading to the assessment. Then I apply my risk controls with a goal to reduce my exposure, my risk. And then I have a residual risk that is hopefully acceptable. And if it is not acceptable, I go back to the beginning and identify or re-estimate the risk and identify additional controls or new controls I may need to apply in order to get my residual risk down to an acceptable level. And clearly, this is not a one-time process. I should continually revisit that because risks change, new threats develop, new vulnerabilities become known. There may be a new use case for my device. I may be doing something with it that it was not the initial intended use of the device, and so forth. So there are many reasons why risk management should be a continual process rather than just a thing I do once during the design and development process. So if I look at cyber risk, again, the risk control is a mean to reduce either severity or probability. And I talk about mitigation, which are measures to reduce probability and or severity. Anti-malware software on my desktop computer is a good example. With anti-malware software, I make it less likely that a computer gets compromised, and If it gets compromised, it is less severe because my computer is better protected, right? So with anti-malware software, I would address both. Contingency is really more a measure that deals with the consequence, meaning the severity of a risk. And a backup or fail-safe mode is a good example. A backup doesn't change the probability of an event occurring, of a cyber compromise occurring, but it reduces the severity because I have data I can use to restore my systems. Then there's also risk transfer, and that is transferred to a third party through insurance. As one example, I can take out cyber insurance to mitigate some aspects of risk, but as any insurance, it can be tricky. Is it applicable? Does it cover? Does it cover everything? And so forth. So certainly it is a path, but it is a tricky path. And then lastly, there's risk acceptance, right? If the risk is low enough, it can be accepted. That is a perfect normal decision. There's no system that is completely free of risk, but systems should be only having risks that are low enough that they can be accepted. Risk mitigation in specific is the application of one or more measures to reduce probability of occurrence and or lessen the consequence. Right. So those are risk reduction controls based on risk management priorities and analysis of alternatives. A firewall is a good example. Anti-malware software we already talked about, but also architectural decisions, design decisions, and so forth. So here's an example for risk mitigation, not a very good one, hopefully not a permanent one, hopefully just a temporary approach to mitigating the risk here. And here's an example of risk transfer right through, in this particular example, labeling, which is something medical device manufacturers can use, but should use cautiously. Right? I can't transfer every risk to the operator of the device. Don't put it on the network, in my opinion, is not a good measure of risk transfer. Okay, and now I'm going to go through the terminology again, but in a more technical sense. Right? Before it was more the risk view, the strategic view. Now it's going to be more the tactical approach. So asset we already talked about earlier, it is a device, data on a device, any value that a device may hold. And typically my assets are well protected within an individual system, or if I look at my entire organization within the larger enterprise through network controls and firewalls and whatnot. So everything is fine until, and I'm protected against threats until I introduce a vulnerability, but the vulnerability being a hole in my protective wall. And typically I have not just one, I have multiple. So I talk about an attack surface, and then the threat that exploits a given vulnerability, that is what we call an attack vector. An attack vector is not necessarily nice and straight as it is shown here. It may actually involve multiple steps. For example, use an email and social engineering tactics to get a hold of a user's username and password, and then use that username and password to hack into a system. So that is a multi-step type of attack vector. Once I observe adverse activity on the inside of my system or my enterprise, I talk about a security event. And if the attack compromises an asset, then I talk about an incident. And then on the outside here, I have what is vaguely defined as the threat landscape, which is basically the adversaries, the hacking groups, the organizations that are, cooking up all those attacks, and then the exploits, which are the tools and the methods they're using, as well as the observation and the trends that we can observe in the threat landscape. Security companies and also governments on a regular basis provide various reports about the threat landscape in general or specific topics like mobile threats or 5G threats or whatever. If you look around, you find plenty of reports that give you fairly accurate information on how threats are changing. So I have basically cyber hazards on the left and cyber harm on the right. And again, I can use probability and severity to estimate risk. But as always, this is a model, and an estimation is exactly that. It is an estimation. It does not necessarily predict actual events or reality. So we always need to be prepared for things turning out different than we plan. And then the other point I made earlier is the point of exploitability versus probability. So in cybersecurity, yes, there's historic data, right? We know the hackers out there, we know the malware they are producing, but a lot is uncertain as far as the future is concerned. And therefore, if I look at a specific weakness or vulnerability, it is better to look at how exploitable it would be rather than whether it has happened or not. And then last point on this slide here is, you clearly see we have external components here and internal components. Now, typically, as a hospital, as a medical device company, as a software manufacturer, I only have control over what is on the right, the internal components, right? Unless I'm government or law enforcement, I really have very little control to everything on the left. I need to understand it. I need to understand the trends and what is happening out there. But again, I can only control it by protecting my asset, by reducing my vulnerabilities, and not by changing what I can't control on the outside. So why should we care? Two quick examples here. This is a graph from early 2020 when the world, including healthcare, started to deal with COVID, right? And this particular company took record of the mentioning of names of telemedicine companies on the dark web, right, in chat rooms and whatever. And clearly, as we as healthcare organizations started to deal with COVID, started to send patients home, started to send employees home, started to provide telemedicine services, guess what? The names of telemedicine companies were identified as an opportunity, and they were discussed in the chat rooms. So clearly, there are events that at first look may not even appear to be cyber related, but can have impact on cybersecurity and can change on the complexity on what we're dealing with. Second example is dealing with the impact, and there are many other research studies and examples that all show the same, right? So this particular study looked at the impact of mortality rate after a cybersecurity event at a hospital, let's say a ransomware attack or a similar event. And it demonstrated that not only did the mortality rate increase, but it also actually increased for several years after the attack. So clearly, cybersecurity measures implemented in response to the cyber attack had a negative effect on patient outcomes, right? And that is clearly why cybersecurity in healthcare is such a tricky subject. And it is easy to implement certain security measures. It is difficult to implement security measures that don't compromise care delivery, right? And that is what we as medical device manufacturers, as healthcare providers, even regulators and lawmakers are dealing with in healthcare, right? You don't want to implement security and by that making other things worse, like delay care or increase the risk of failure of care delivery. So clearly we need to be very careful, but it also again shows you that as we deal with healthcare cyber risks, it's a very complex and very dynamic type of situation. I'm not going to go through those. I call these my good news slides because they just summarize what I just talked about. The only one I want to repeat here is the last two, event and incident, right? They're often used interchangeably, but at least from an academic perspective, they are not, right? An event is purely an observation. An incident is a compromise of an asset. And again, the other definitions are here. We don't need to go through all of those. You're going to get the handout. Same as here. The link at the bottom is a good resource if you're looking for other cybersecurity terms. This is a very good dictionary or glossary. There are a couple of others around, but this one is very comprehensive. Here's a list of various terms as they relate to malware and viruses, and a couple of other security terms you may come across. Again, don't want to spend time on it here. I think these are sufficiently clear to everybody. couple of terms that are actually ambiguous and sometimes are used incorrectly or can be used differently by different people. Right. The first one is this term breach, especially in healthcare, where we have under HIPAA here in the US this thing called breach notification rule. A breach is typically understood as the exfiltration of data. But in cybersecurity in general, a breach may also be used as describing a compromise of security defenses. Right? I breached the castle walls and I got to the inside. So a more general use of the term breach. So be aware that that can be used in different ways. Secondly, is the term legacy, which again, depending on who you are and where you come from, has slightly different meaning. Right? As a hospital, typically you call legacy a device that is no longer supported either as a whole or one of its key software components by the manufacturer. Right? You may have an end of life, end of support operating system, for example. As a manufacturer, legacy is probably the end of feature development for you. As a regulator or standards body, legacy may mean a device that was developed before a certain standard was available or became enforced. I think the most common definition that people are kind of standardizing on is the one the IMDRF came up with, IMDRF being the International Medical Device Regulator Forum. They define medical device as, or legacy medical device as a device that cannot be reasonably protected against current cybersecurity threats. I have some issues with that definition. I don't think it is perfect. I think it's a good attempt. But for example, um, this does not differentiate between internal and external security control. So by definition, I could say, hey, if I don't put my device on a network, it is reasonably protected, right? Well, that, in my opinion, does not make a device not being legacy. And then again, a couple of other things, but I think that's a problem. If you try to come up with a short and concise definition, you always struggle with the corner cases. Couple of things I frequently see when I proofread or read publications, and confusions between a breach and a breach, or a threat and a threat, or HIPAA and HIPAA. And actually, recently I was doing some research on cybersecurity education, and I found some well-known academic institutions that offer healthcare or medical device cybersecurity courses, but don't even know how to spell HIPAA correctly. And I think that probably greatly reduces the trust in the value of the respective courses of these organizations. And then, of course, there is pen testing, which, if you're not familiar with the term, could be completely misunderstood. So that was it for terminology. Briefly want to touch on a couple of other things. Here, the first one being secure product lifecycle management. This particular graph, in my opinion, is one of the best representations of what the life cycles of medical devices look like. My friend Chris Gates came up with this when we worked together on the HISAC white paper, which I encourage everybody to download. excuse me, to download. And what I like about this is that it really breaks down the very different nature of the four main life cycles. But it is not just one. You have the manufacturer, and their life cycle is typically per device or per device version. You have a supply chain, and depending on whether that particular software component is open source or it's a commercial operating system, it may move very quickly or it may move slower. Then you have the healthcare organization, where the life cycle is more about the individual physical device, right? I may buy one CT scanner today, I may buy another one next year, but they're the same CT scanner, or I may retire 10 of my infusion pumps, but keep the other 900, right? So clearly the meaning end of life for the manufacturer typically means end of a device or device version, whereas for the healthcare organization, it is more process of decommissioning a physical device. So those four wheels in this diagram spin at different speeds, right? That needs to be understood. And that is why I said earlier, I like this diagram actually quite a lot, because many other things I see and read, they kind of muddle those together as if they were, all one life cycle. And that is unfortunately not true and not correct and can lead to misunderstandings. So if I now take the manufacturer life cycle and kind of uncurl that circle here, right? So I have again the steps from concept through end of life, end of support, and as a manufacturer, I undertake specific activities, and these are just examples, not a complete listing, during those various steps. And I'm honing in here, of course, on security-related activities, right? I need to identify the markets I'm going to sell my device in, because then I know whether MDR applies or doesn't apply, whether FDA applies or doesn't apply. I need to identify my risk tolerance. Right? You look at, for example, product launch or financial risks. If I'm a single product startup company, my risk is much higher than if I am a large international multi-product line company where a delay of the launch of one product, is still costly, but it doesn't sink my company. And again, those goes through the entire life cycle here, where we should have very specific security activities, and in parallel should also generate very specific security documentation. Right? And that starts in the planning phase, in your architecture phase, and all the way to your release process, where you provide and generate regulatory artifacts, and in the end provide certain documentation and maintain that documentation to the end user. Threat modeling, actually, we're going to talk about in a moment, so I'm going to skip that here. So if you map this all out, I think every medical device manufacturer should have a security-specific set of policies and procedures in place, and should engage in a set of security-specific activities, and that should span across all those life cycle phases, from concept, over planning, implementation, all the way to end of life. And of course, nothing stands on its own. It's all related across the life cycles, but also related to other processes that are not specific to security. For example, your safety risk management or your overall quality system. Now, talking about threat modeling a little bit here next. So threat modeling is basically a systematic approach to identify threats and reduce risk through architecture and design decisions. Right? That's the preliminary purpose. I may change my architecture, I may change my design, I may replace a supplier based on the analysis I do during this threat modeling exercise. Right? And it is highly encouraged, doesn't matter which regulations you're looking at, whether it is MDR, IVDR, whether it is Health Canada, Australia, US FDA, everybody recommends threat modeling as a key security activity. It is not the only one, but it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings, where you have the one that rules them all. A lot of activities fall out of threat modeling and determine your future activities. So you want to identify, reduce potential risks, and that includes patient safety risks. And threat modeling as such is not once and done. It's a continual process, but it purpose changes. In the beginning, doing architecture and design, yes, it is indeed about making architectural and design decisions. But then if you go to release and produce your regulatory artifacts, it's more like demonstrating that you have done your threat modeling and that you have mitigated the risks that were identified during threat modeling. And then even post-market, you can use threat modeling to, for example, better understand the impact, the risk of newly identified vulnerabilities. So the main purpose, again, is during architecture and design. That is where ideally you should stand up your threat model, but then you're going to go back to it through the life cycle of the device, but for different purposes. And then obviously, cybersecurity by itself, right, has no purpose. For example, encryption is a good cybersecurity control, a good cybersecurity measure. But what type of data I need to encrypt, I cannot tell without doing a privacy assessment, right? Or what type of data that flows, let's say, between a planning device and a therapy device needs to be cryptographically signed to assure safety that the data is not compromised while it travels the network, right? I can only understand whether I need to cryptographically sign that data once I understand the safety risk of that data. Right? So therefore, really, security, and I'm using a diagram here out of TIR 57, specifically comparing security and safety, but you can draw similar diagrams for security and privacy, security and financial risk, and. The point is that, again, the level of security you need needs to be defined through other risk considerations, and those are predominantly safety and privacy risks, but also others like business and regulatory risks. But then in turn, once you implement security, you deliver and mitigate those safety and privacy risks. So that needs to be understood. There is that relationship between a baseline, defining the security requirements, and then delivering on it. So that's the concept here. Another one I want to briefly talk about is vulnerability management in both pre and post market. And we already touched on this briefly. Now there's different schemes out there I can use to identify software components, CPE being one of them. There are different ways of describing common weaknesses that end up in software systems, CWE being one of them, and then CWSS as a scoring system. And then there are different schemes out there to describe vulnerabilities, identify vulnerabilities, and score vulnerabilities, right? The difference between a weakness and a vulnerability is, simple example, a weakness is that a common way of burglars breaking into a house is that people forget to lock their front door. A vulnerability is the front door at 57 Main Street is unlocked. Right? That is, very specific. And again, those schemes exist. They're not perfect. In fact, if you are, going through the process of designing a product, and if you have, for example, your software bill of material, and you're trying to match that against, let's say, a national vulnerability database to identify the software components in that database and the associated vulnerabilities that come with that software component, I think you're going to have a challenge because unfortunately, naming is not very well standardized, and the the software tool you're using may not use the same naming conventions as NVD does, or within NVD, somebody who puts something into the database, may make different decisions, even in the process of assigning a name to a software component. So unfortunately, it's neither stable nor uniform nor easy. So it's actually quite a complex matching process. But I mean, the concept underneath it is you have a number of metrics you use to score a vulnerability. Again, there are several other scoring systems out there. I think several of them actually have the merit of being more suitable than CVSS. But as it turns out, CVSS is the most commonly used and most commonly promoted. I think it's useful for software components. I think you're going to have some challenges if you look at using it for complete devices, for example. And even CVSS itself says that it was never designed to automatically stack rank risk. Right? It is one component in characterizing a vulnerability, which then is one component in determining the level of a risk you have, but it is not the only one. So I caution everybody to use CVSS for automatic stack ranking of risk. Now there are many vulnerabilities. How many? Well, this is the latest NVD data I pulled couple of 2 months ago. You can see that 2021 we had over 20,000 new vulnerabilities reported in NVD, and the bad news is First of all, there are other databases that have additional vulnerability information. There are also several software vendors that don't disclose in NVD that they have their own databases. And then even within NVD, many vulnerabilities were never assigned a CVE, so they're actually not identifiable within NVD. And then, of course, we have 20% of the ones that are logged are remotely exploitable, meaning they are quite critical, and 4%, which is still a significant number, have no actual information available. So you just have the information that there is a vulnerability, but not what to do about it. So certainly a complex and very dynamic situation. Now, how do you address that both in pre-market and post-market? Obviously, you have information about your architecture and design. You have information about your software composition via the SBOM. You should be able to identify and analyze vulnerabilities, again, with the caveats I mentioned earlier. Now, during the design phase or the development phase, right, I have seen companies make the decision and say, yeah, I'm dealing with a large number, hundreds, if not thousands of vulnerabilities. I cannot take the time to analyze each individual of them. So in the development phase, I'm just going to use straight CVSS ranking, realizing that I may misscore some vulnerabilities, right? I may fix things that are maybe not necessary to be fixing, or I may approve things that in my particular implementation actually could have a higher risk. But initially, I just look at volume, knowing that there's going to be then a more complex and more expert-driven risk assessment following after, where people then look at the complete product, look at exploitability in my particular implementation, and look at risk in the use context of the actual device, right? And that is then a higher effort undertaking, but I'm dealing with a lower volume, right? And then, of course, whatever comes out of my risk assessment, I need to then address and need to track in my ticketing or risk management system, need to potentially update inventory or phase it into manufacturing, and need to disclose and provide a patch or update to my customers. So this is one, possible path on how companies can implement both in the pre-market but also in the post-market stage vulnerability management. So coming to an end here, wrapping up, unfortunately, in cybersecurity, especially in a complex field like medical device cybersecurity, there is no silver bullet, right? Any security vendor that tells you they have the magic tool, the magic process that makes all your problems go away is probably lying to you. The true reality is it is challenging, it is complex, and many times it comes down to a trade-off between the desired level of security of your product, the cost, but also things like reliability, usability, right? You don't want to implement security features that could impact the device's clinical performance or the device's usability, right? Two-factor access control on an infusion pump for a clinical user is an unreasonable security control. Now, two-factor access control for a remote service technician that accesses the pump through the back door, yes, that is a reasonable security control, right? So understand the use case, understand the risk, the benefit, and the trade-off, and lastly, be aware of unintended consequences. Last couple of slides here on resources, right? Understand your customers. There are luckily a couple of initiatives underway here in the US, but also in Europe, that standardize how your customers, talking to medical device manufacturers now, articulate their security needs in their RFIs, RFPs, or contracting process. Right? There's the Manufacturer Disclosure Statement for Medical Device Security, short MDS2. And then on the right, the two documents are procurement guidelines and contract language that hospitals have started to use to articulate their security needs as they purchase medical devices. Now, the good news for you as a manufacturer is that standardizes the requests, the questions you're getting. Right? You're not going to get a different set of questions from every hospital that is buying from you. I don't think either of those three is complete. I think there's still a couple of things that are not addressed in them, but at least, again, 90% of questions are properly standardized in here, and hopefully makes it easier for you as a manufacturer to answer those questions and provide the right security procedures, but also technical controls in response. And then here, a couple of books. The ones on the left is actually more focused on healthcare delivery organizations, clinical engineers, and HTM managers that manage medical device networks. And then the two on the right are focused on medical device manufacturers. The one in the middle is more engineering focused. It's more technical, whereas the one on the right from Anna Bray at Abbott is more from a regulatory and quality system perspective. So, even though I wasn't involved in the one in the middle, I don't see Arnab's book as competition. I actually bought it myself and found it quite informative, I think, again, because they take a different angle to the topic. They're complementary books, and medical device manufacturers should have both of them in their libraries. And with that, it's a wrap. If you have questions, I believe you should be able to unmute. If not, we have a Q&A you can use.